Okay, we are live with Alexander Mercurs in London, and we are joined by one of our most favorite guests on the Duran, the amazing Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Professor Sachs, how are you doing today?
Hey, great to be with you guys.
It's great
What
to
a
have you on.
world.
Yes, things are very interesting in the world these days. We have Professor Sachs's information in the description box down below, and I will add it as a pinned comment as well. So, Alexander, Professor Sachs, what should we discuss in the world today?
Well,
We could go for hours.
we could go
whatever
for
you
us.
want.
We've only got you 30 minutes. So let's go straight in and let's discuss war and peace, and specifically war and peace in Europe, which, given that we, Alex and I, are in Europe, is obviously a serious matter for us. And two things to say. Firstly, it's quite astonishing to me that good news for Europe and the world, that there are attempts to achieve peace, is seen as bad news by so many people. I mean, that is really astonishing. But the second thing, and the thing I really want to talk about, and since we've only got you for a limited time, let's go straight in, is this titanic, exceptional speech that you delivered to the European Parliament, in which basically you lay out the whole story, the whole history of East-West relations, Russia-West relations, since the time of the fall of the Soviet Union. You provide the whole context of Western decision-making during that period. And, well, I have to throw it in, this extraordinary conversation you had with Jake Sullivan, which lots of people are talking about, and which, I made my eyes pop out of my head when I saw it. But I'm going to go straight in, and I'm going to ask you to just summarize what you said in your speech. I know it would probably be difficult to do in a few minutes, but
Well, it was
if you can go straight in and discuss it, yeah.
It was a wonderful opportunity. There is a small peace group in the European Parliament. They invited me to speak. A former colleague of mine, now member of Parliament of the European Parliament, Michael van der Schulenburg, who was an exceptional leader at the UN and someone that was involved in many conflicts around the world and in trying to end them. So he's very much on the path of peace. Co-leads a small group of parliamentarians, because most of the mainstream parties in Europe are still war parties. And so this was a great occasion to talk to the parliamentarians, because they came from across the political factions and at least listened politely to me. And since then, there's been a lot of feedback. My main point was that the United States basically just seriously messed up from the late 1980s until the last few weeks, actually, because, and I saw it with my own eyes. I was an economic advisor to Gorbachev's economic team in 1990, 91. I was an advisor to President Yeltsin's economic team in 1991 to 1993. I was an economic advisor to President Kuchma of Ukraine in 1993, 94. I've seen it from both sides. I've been called in by Ukraine since then on occasions. After the Maidan, the government asked me to come in. So I learned a bit of awful stuff about the Maidan as well, by personal sight of what was going on. The upshot of all of this was that Gorbachev and Yeltsin and the world at that time, the Soviet world and the Russian Federation, said, let's end the Cold War, let's have peace. And the United States could not think in that term. The United States said, oh, we get it, we won, you lost, we do what we want, it's now the unipolar world. And I think the Soviets and the Russians said, no, that's not exactly what we mean. Why don't we have peace and cooperation? And the United States said, yeah, we get it. We win, you lose, we do what we want. This is the essence of the 30 years from 1990 onward. the United States decided, well, we have all the power. We can be a bully. We can do what we want. We can go back on any commitments made. We can overthrow governments. We can back out of the nuclear arms framework, whatever we want. We are America. So that's my summary in very simple terms. In particular, starting in 1990, February 7th, 1990, the United States and Germany, in the context of German reunification, told the Soviet leadership and Mikhail Gorbachev to his face in absolutely explicit terms that our governments have lied about ever since. NATO will not move 1 inch eastward in the context of the Soviet Union ending the Warsaw Pact military alliance and in the context of German reunification. There was a basic deal. Germany will reunify because that was a legal agreement that needed to be reached to end World War II, actually, in 1990. World War II was not ended by a treaty. It was ended by the 4+2 process in 1990 to reunify Germany. One of the reasons for the Cold War, in fact, was that there was no treaty after World War II because the Western alliance didn't want a treaty. The Soviet Union said, let's have a neutral, demilitarized Germany. The West said, no, we will remilitarize Germany. We will create NATO. We will create the Federal Republic of Germany without a treaty. The Soviet Union said, but our security. And the West said at that time, back in the 1940s, not your security, it's our NATO. Okay. Well, there was no end to World War II until 1990 from a diplomatic and juridical point of view. And in that context, the commitment was NATO will not move 1 inch eastward. Soviet Union ended in 1991, as we know, in December. I was almost in the room when that happened because I was literally sitting in front of Boris Yeltsin. I don't know if we talked about this before, but in December 1991, I led an economic delegation to speak with President Yeltsin. He came from the back of a room in the Kremlin, sat down directly in front of me because I was leading the delegation. And he said, gentlemen, I can announce the Soviet Union is over. So I heard it with my own ears to my face. That moment. Oh, I assured him the West will be overjoyed and give him all the financial help for stabilization and so forth. That's what I thought. Rather naive. Of course, the United States did not lift a finger to help this new democratization, this transformation, this historic moment, because while President Yeltsin was trying to grapple with the profound economic crisis, the United States was saying, we won, you lost, we do what we want. And there was absolutely no sense in Washington that this was an opportunity for sustained peace other than the unipolar US world. So the story I said in the European Parliament was immediately the US planned to break its promise and to expand NATO. Bill Clinton, who followed George Bush Sr. In 1994, made the decision, and it was a decision we learned from the historians to go all the way to Ukraine. Already then, the idea was NATO, we go as far as we want. And we know that the US deep state had the vision from then onward that just like the Soviet Union fell apart, we will help Russia to fall apart. Russia can disintegrate into its ethnic nations. Brzezinski in 1997 talked about Russia becoming a confederation of three loosely connected parts, a European part, a Siberian part, and an East Asian part. The grandiosity of the Western vision had no limits. This was, after all, the end of history, as we were told. And the end of history was American hegemony. Well, it did not go well. The Europeans, by the way, knew something's off with this. They didn't just quietly go along. We should remember that as late as 2003, we had European politicians saying no to the war in Iraq, which was a war on absolutely fake premises. It was a war that Bibi Netanyahu talked the U.S. into doing on behalf of Israel. This is what that war was about. And the Europeans, they didn't support it. The Germans opposed it. The French opposed it. Of course, the British went along. Sorry to say, they always go along, partly because they always go along and partly because Britain never saw a war it didn't like. This is part of the British imperial nostalgia. But the continental Europeans opposed the Iraq War. But that was basically the last time they opposed the United States. And in this grandiosity of the United States, this expansion of NATO, which came in waves, first Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, second wave in 2004 was the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Balkan states, Bulgaria and Romania, Slovakia and Slovenia, Central Europe and the Balkans. That's when President Putin said, "Stop already. You lied to us, you cheated, but do not come closer." And of course, these maniac neocons listened to President Putin and said, "Oh, he doesn't want us to come closer, so we must continue," is the American thinking. 2008 was the showdown in Bucharest at the NATO summit. That was the last moment that Europe had a foreign policy. In the first day of the NATO summit, Merkel and Sarkozy opposed the call by George Bush Jr. To announce a plan for NATO enlargement to Ukraine and to Georgia. The next day, they folded their hands by agreeing that NATO would announce, albeit without a timeline and a plan, that Ukraine would become a NATO member. To my mind, that was the last moment there was a European foreign policy. After that moment, everything was in lockstep with the US neocons. And a whole generation of European politicians rose up, cultivated by US money, cultivated by the military-industrial complex network of so-called think tanks, which are the opposite of think tanks. They are the no think tank, please. They do not have any independent thinking. The Atlantic Council, the German Marshall Fund, all of these places basically became neocon breeding grounds for Europe's political class. And we didn't hear a peep. Interestingly, you know, I catch glimpses of all of this. I'm an economist. I'm not in the security world. But European leaders tell me things because I speak, you know, to the top leadership, usually about economic matters. But after Bucharest, one of the European leaders said to me, "Can't believe what your president did. You know, so reckless. We know how dangerous this is, but not a peep in public." This is the great lie to the European people. In private, they say this was terrible. In public, yes, we follow the US line. Yes, NATO will enlarge. And of course, we know the sequence of events after that. The US paid for most of perhaps, the Maidan insurrection, the violent coup. The U.S. was deeply involved in the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych. I'm sure we'll learn a lot more about that in the years ahead. I happened to catch a glimpse of that also by someone explaining to me after the Maidan, but on the Maidan, while people were still milling around, because I was called in to meet with the new government. And I went because I went as a courtesy, because I had advised beforehand. And somebody explained to me how much money the Americans put into the Maidan insurrection. Really unpleasant stuff. I couldn't stand it. It just it was god awful to think about yet another U.S. regime change operation. One more thing to add to the mix that I emphasized in the European Parliament. Not only did the U.S. expand NATO, not only did it engage in multiple wars of choice, many of them, by the way, on behalf of Bibi Netanyahu and Israel's what I regard as absolutely extremist agenda. But the U.S. did one other thing that was at least as consequential, probably much more consequential, and underemphasized. And that is that in 2002, the U.S. unilaterally abandoned the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which was a complete foundational bulwark of nuclear arms control, because the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty was part of a framework to prevent one side or another from attempting or achieving a first strike capability on the other, a decapitation strike. The idea is if you don't have anti-ballistic missiles, or if you have just a few of them, then if you attack, the other side will be able to counterattack, and you won't have the anti-ballistic missiles to protect your side. So thereby there will be nuclear deterrence. But in 2002, the United States abandoned the basic concept of nuclear deterrence and said, no, we do what we want. We put anti-ballistic missiles where we want, starting in Poland, then in Romania, and then absolutely consequentially telling the Russians, yeah, even in Ukraine, if we want, which is apparently what Antony Blinken told Foreign Minister Lavrov in January 2022, according to the former CIA analyst and wonderful person and analyst Ray McGovern. So, three fundamental aspects of U.S. foreign policy: expand NATO forever, surround Russia in the Black Sea region, keep the U.S. military expanding, number one; regime change operations and wars of choice, number two; and three, abandon the nuclear arms control framework. That's the basis of why we ended up in this disaster in Ukraine. That's what I told the European Parliament. Of course, they don't hear a word of this in the mainstream media. This is all documented, known to historians, known to people who have been involved in this, known to me as an economist who has been involved in this region for more than 30 years, because it's right there to look at if someone would look at it. And my main message to the European parliamentarians is, for God's sake, get a foreign policy, learn the history, understand how you've been walked into this disaster. Well, I told them all of that. Here comes President Trump and says, we'll end the disaster. Thank you. This is this 30-year neocon failure. I think for Trump, the main thing is it's a failure. Ukraine's getting destroyed. One of the, by the way, just as a quick digression, I think one of the clever but true things that is a common quip is that the Russians play chess and the Americans play poker. And I think that this is basically right. The Russians are looking at the long term. The Americans are bluffing. The Americans are playing a hand. And the neocons were a mix of delusion and bluff. But there was a lot of bluff in it. There was the idea, Russia can't do anything. We're so good. We're so powerful. They're going to fold. They're going to fold. At every step, the idea was they're going to fold. We're going to warn them. No SWIFT banking system. We're going to warn them. HIMARS. We're going to warn them. ATACMS. They're going to fold their hand. Americans, it's filled with idiocy. I'm telling you, it's something to behold. So that's the story I told them. It's a correct rendering of history. It's extraordinarily sad. And the perversity of all of this is that now there's an exit ramp. Now Europe could get its act together, but to this moment, it refuses to do so.